I am going to start with the Raincoats, and Josh's going to run the numbers in a second, but what you're going to listen to right now is a snippet from Only Loved at Night.
Near the size of tall buildings, how dear they kiss could be. Those buildings that saw the airplanes that kissed the air in vain fantasy. Only loved at night, the lady in the dark.
And there you go. That was track number 3 on the 9-song album ODYSHAPE from the Raincoats. Josh, why don't you run the numbers for us?
It is 646 in the top albums of the 80s, according to besteveralbums.com. It is the... Oh, where do I... See, this is why I don't do the numbers. It is 4,263rd best album of all time.
Oof.
And where does it say their best in their rankings? Oh, it's their second best out of 6 albums.
Oh, there you go.
Yes.
You were able to figure it all out together right there. So you did, and by the time we do the other albums, you're going to sound like Matt on that one.
Yes, I'll know where to go now.
So there you go. So this is considered the second highest rated album by them, and it's their second album.
And behind their debut is their considered their best.
So we're going to cover both. So that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we didn't do a bio on the Raincoats, so I'm going to really quickly sketch out a little bit of a bio. I apologize for the thrown together nature of it, but just to give a little bit of context here, feel that we're doing it right there. So the Raincoats have a really interesting story because they were formed in 1977. They were formed by Gina Birch and Anne De Silva. They were both students at the Hornsey School of Art in London. Mm-hmm. And kind of the story seems to be that they were really inspired by punk music at the time that was coming, obviously in 1977.
Yeah.
In Great Britain, there was no shortage of punk bands. I feel like we covered a ton of them, over the time. I think what's very interesting, though, about them, Josh, is that instead of kind of going the direction of like the Damned and the Clash and, a lot of these male-oriented bands, right, and even sort of like X-Ray Specs, right, or Susie and the Banshees, and, we haven't done yet, but sort of covered there, they kind of went in a different direction. They kind of were like punk meets avant-garde a little bit, would you say?
I mean, based on this album, certainly.
Right. One,
and this album, I would say.
Well, it's described on AllMusic. I did write a note down that it said they had little interest in the speed or velocity of the Sex Pistols and the Clash, instead embracing a more open and dynamic approach with chaotic arrangements. And they weren't trained musicians, too, which I should say. Which is an interesting dynamic as well. Yeah, so for those that are wondering, De Silva played the guitar and sang, and Birch played the bass and sang. And then they were joined by Ross Creighton on guitar and Nick Turner on drums, but they were gone shortly afterwards, and the band became an all-female lineup.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so that was the lineup that played on the first album. Mm-hmm. Now, by the time this one comes around, and if you remember, they have like a little bit of an overlap with the Slits because they took Palmolive from the Slits.
Right, and we covered them in the same episode, actually.
You got it, exactly. And Palmolive was on the drums, but she's actually gone, and they actually didn't replace her on this album. They just brought in sort of guest drummers that included Charles Hayward of This Heat and Robert Wyatt. So two people we covered. Yeah. Robert Wyatt with Rock Bottom we covered, and then we did cover This Heat. Right. So it's there. So they don't really have a formal percussionist on this album. And also they added Ingrid Weiss as well, who was theoretically a percussionist. And yeah, so it's kind of an interesting mix. But I think the most interesting thing is, Birch and De Silva kind of had like a tumultuous relationship, and they broke up in 1984. Mm-hmm. And I think the most crazy thing is in 1992, De Silva's working in an antique shop in London, And at the same time, Kurt Cobain's in London. Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, for those that somehow may not know that. And he was a huge Raincoats fan. In fact, I had the album Insecticide, and he actually expounds on his love of the Raincoats in that album. But
like
anyway,
in a song or in the liner notes?
in the liner notes.
Oh wow, nice.
Yeah, and so that's how I knew of who the Raincoats were before I actually had heard the first album. So that's why it was kind of like putting together a puzzle. Like, oh, I know of this band, but I don't know what they sound like. So anyway, Kurt Cobain's looking to replace his copy of the Raincoats album, and he goes to the Rough Trade retail shop, and they say, hey, by the way, a member of the band works nearby. And Kurt Cobain just shows up at the antique shop that she's working at, and one thing leads to another, and he actually gets them to reunite and open for Nirvana.
Oh wow!
He and Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth, another fan, and this leads to them basically reissuing the Raincoats 3 studio albums, and obviously that was not a money-making thing by DGC Records, right? It was mainly, I think, a way to appease Cobain, but also it shows the level of love for them. And, they even end up recording their own EP on Steve Shelley of Sonic Youth's Smells Like Records. So, and that actually it's called Extended Play. That actually leads to a full-length album in 1996, Looking in the Shadows. So they kind of have this second career kind of out of the clear blue, like happenstance.
Right.
So that's a little bit of, how the Raincoats come to prominence. That's enough bio, I think, right now. Why don't you start, Josh? Tell me what your thoughts were on this, initial thoughts.
Yeah, I was really impressed by this album. I really liked it. Now, I seem to recall being kind of lukewarm on their initial album, especially compared to the Slits. I think I like that album more. They're not exactly the same type of band, but I think because they're in that kind of post-punk in the same era, both female fronted, that they were good to compare against in the show. But this seems like a big step up or expansion of their sound. It really does not sound anything like their first album. And while it still maintains kind of their interesting vocal delivery, they really seem to take I don't know for sure, but it seems like they took a lot from world music or different genres of music and really incorporated it into their sound.
I would say that, yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there seems to be 100 different instruments on this album.
Yes, and bizarre, and I'll go into that on my thing, but yes, not just the standard. It sounds just come at you from all angles. Yeah,
yeah, and it really has a vibe to it that I would describe as, I don't know, like the ocean or something, or swaying trees. It really has an ebb and flow to it.
Okay.
The songs, that's the vibe I got. The songs seem to speed up and then slow down many times throughout the same song, and that kind of carries throughout the whole album, in my opinion. It also, but not in it's not doing it in a jarring way. It's very kind of rhythmic and gentle at times too. So, but saying that, it's really complicated, this album, but in a very intriguing way, and worth multiple listens, in my opinion. There is oftentimes, I should also mention that there is a violin that they incorporate into this album as one of the prominent instruments. And
yep, that is Vicky Aspinall, who was actually hired as a violinist for the band. One of the females that made the band full female from the male. They replaced the males with a new drummer and then a violinist in place of the old person, or the old male who I think was playing another guitar, if I remember correctly.
Gotcha. And that violin is used all different ways. It's very scratchy and aggressive at times. Sometimes it's more complimentary and folksy, and then they just really incorporate it, like all the instruments, in very different ways, and in ways you don't expect. This album sounds like influential in a way a lot of indie bands later on would sound, in my mind. Like I'm talking like 2010 band that incorporate world music and kind of interesting vocal traditions.
Was there any band that like was a direct corollary for you, or more of just a amalgamation?
So my wife Emily listens to this artist Laura Moval, who is,
okay, I
think she's British, and that really kind of came to the fore. She's a solo artist, but she uses a lot of like I'd say like Afro beat sounds, or kind of incorporates them into her music, and that kind of sprang to mind when I was listening to this. But it's a good question because I couldn't think of other examples, but it does feel like there's something here that people took, artists took to their music. This was really kind of like the sweet spot for me in terms of avant-garde artistic type of music. It didn't push the envelope too far in terms of, you know, some of those more out there artists that we talked about, like you know, the Residents or Public Image Limited or Throbbing Gristle, any of those kind of later, even This Heat. This is still kind of like rhythmic music that you can listen to and grasp onto, and there's a lot that you can kind of uncover while listening to this album. So I don't know if I did a good job musically explaining it, but it really did. It was an enjoyable listen, and and maybe something in your thing will your review will spring additional thoughts from me. But yeah,
well, I think it's hard to describe the sound of this because it's like a cacophony of sounds would be the best way I'd describe it. But it's when I say that, there's not one mood altogether. It's very tender at times. It's very chaotic at times. I was trying to think of a word to describe it, and then in just doing the research, you know, for the little bit of a bio, I heard the album described as jittery, which I thought was a great word for it at times, because that is a little bit of the vibe that I felt at different times. The first thing that stands out to me about this album is that really only half the tracks have percussion. And in the place of the percussion, you've got things like the violin and a lot of like African instruments would be the best way I'd describe it. Like I was looking at the list of instruments played, and it seems like what happened was they sort of just grabbed instruments and just said, hey, you know, the punk DIY ethos, let's just try to play it and see what we can do with it. And as a result, I think how they played it probably isn't by the book of how it's supposed to sound sometimes, but it kind of works at times. But to give you an idea, the African balafone is on this, the bowed bass is on net, the balalika, there's hand drums, there's finger cymbals, there's harmonica, you know, along with the non-traditional instruments they had before, like the violin, and there's piano. It's a mishmash of everything. And so I enjoyed this. It is very different than the first album. The first album, I'd kind of say, was like taking the blueprint of what the Slits did and making it kind of avant-garde in the way that people, you know, not as harsh, but sort of like what Public Image Limited or Throbbing Gristle did, right? You know, some of the elements of that, it was like a mix, right? And it existed in that post-punk landscape, but it was challenging. This seems a little... At some points, it seems more polished, and sometimes it seems like let's play these sounds and see what they sound like together. But it almost as like an atmosphere would be the best way I'd describe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I would say, like, to add on to that though, that the instruments do kind of work well together. It's not this sort of chaos in terms of I can't track what's going on. They've constructed it in such a way that they do kind of meld together in a way that works for me.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's some there's like, you know, there's elements of reggae in this album, or even like dub reggae. I put some notes down, like
Dancing in My Head.
Like Dancing in My Head for sure, like has that element in it. And you know, there's things like European Sun and Black Angel's Depth Song that are more, as I described it, atmospheric, and then like The Void is like that was, I'm trying to remember, The Void was like, was that on the first album? I was trying to think back to like different points, but there were some songs that were chaotic as well. Like Red Shoes, right, was a little bit more chaotic.
That last song, Go Away, was most chaotic. I would think.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and I think that's why I think I'm thinking, and that's why for some reason I was thinking of that song, The Void, and I'm trying to remember if that was on the first album. I apologize. It kept coming to the mind for me. Is The Void on the first album? I'm looking right now as we go. Yeah. But yeah, it is. It's song number 7 on the first, and I remember writing a note on it, and The Void is very similar to like is similar in terms of the chaoticness, right, of the last track, but I really enjoyed the album for challenging me. Now, does it have a ton of replayability for me? It does, in the sense that I want to peel back more of the layers to hear what's going on, because it's that oxymoron of simple complex. Like, on one hand, it's simple, but you can peel away the layers and you know there's complexity to it. But I don't know if the complexity comes from studio tricks or, you know, real new, like prog rock, you know, type stuff where they're bundling. I think it's more because they were sort of just playing around with stuff and seeing how sounds worked, and, you know, kind of going from a DIY perspective. It like the new nuances are going to come from hearing things from a different angle or an unexpected angle to where you would expect the track to go. And so in that sense, it's kind of avant-garde. But in a different way, less planned or cunning, and more just sort of raw. And I guess that's where the punk comes in, right?
Yeah, and they, you know, along with all these instruments, like you said, you hear kind of some reggae at times. I heard some Indian, probably influenced Eastern type of sounds, and Only Love at Night. I heard in Red Shoes, the violin is played in such a way that reminds me of like, almost like a folksy Americana, Old West Appalachian music or something like that. And then sometimes you do have the kind of the chaos and almost like chanting in their vocals, or just kind of,
or that like percussion does show up, but then there's no percussion in another song. It's very odd. It's very odd to have an album that's strong percussion in some songs and none, or by proxy percussion.
Right.
From another instrument instead of a traditional set of drums.
Yeah, you're not going to get any, like you said, you're not going to get any like pop hit single off of this. It's more of it's definitely an album that is to be taken as a whole and parsed out later.
Well, and there's not really a like a coherent sound. Even like some of the avant-garde stuff is easier to describe. This is one of the harder albums I've found to describe. So I would encourage those folks that are intrigued to go listen to this album, because I would put it in the top 1% of albums that are hard to boil down into sonically. It sounds like this because it shift shapes, but also it shift shapes in a way that there aren't hallmarks like of the sound, when we talk about the experimental, krautrock, for example, there's the motoric beat and stuff like that. There's just motifs that we can pick, right? This sort of is more, they're playing with motifs.
And we spent so much time trying to talk about the instrumentation stuff. I didn't even really pay attention to the lyrics. The music kind of overpowered them in my mind.
It's sort of like, I would say when I was looking at the lyrics, it's a lot of feminist themes, right? A feminist in sort of like the punk rock feminist way, though, like, strong female presence, but also an independent spirit, and just different themes like that. But I wouldn't say that I saw an overarching theme, and if there is and folks are more aware of it, I'd love to hear from them, because it didn't stand out to me when I read the lyrics. But you could definitely tell there is a feminine energy in this album because it gets very delicate at times.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think attracts Kurt Cobain to this band?
Well, I think basically whenever you hear about Kurt Cobain, they always talk about how he had, I guess, what would be considered to be a very sensitive or almost female-centric side. Like a lot of the major people in his life were women, strong women, right, in different ways. I mean, Courtney Love was a strong woman. His mother largely raised him. He had a sister who he loved, so a lot of, and, he's often referred to, right, as like as a feminist, especially in the lens of now, right? He kind of raged against like toxic masculinity before anybody would call it toxic masculinity. It was just sort of like, I think back then, I guess they called it like jock culture or something, or that was the vernacular. But I think that's it. There's a vulnerability in terms of both the sounds and certainly the lyrics in the first Raincoats album that I can totally get when you sort of are battling depression and stuff like that. And sonically, there is a little, the Nirvana famously had that Pixies, loud, soft mix. And there is a little bit of that sonically in this as well, when you think about it. But I think that probably, sort of relating to that energy, I think is probably what drew him to it. Yeah. Yeah,
it's definitely something I will take with me once we get to Nirvana in terms of me not knowing really kind of their influences and seeing how this fits in.
Right. Well, famously Nirvana's influences were like, Pixies, the Meat Puppets, and then of course there's the weird ones too. Like Kurt Cobain, like loved Kiss, right? It's like, that's weird. But like, I think back then, right, if you didn't live on the coast, right, and Washington, like everybody sort of liked the loud. So, he's a mix. He was nice enough to leave like a list of his favorite albums in his journal, which they had in Montage Effects. So actually you can kind of get a thumbnail sketch as to what young Kurt Cobain was listening to. But yeah, the Raincoats were heavily represented in that. Nice. Yep. So I feel like it's a cottage industry to say that like Kurt Cobain loved this band. I feel like he comes up a lot. You know what I mean? Oh, did you know Kurt Cobain loved this band? But yeah.
Well, he definitely loved this band, right? Because
a level above, a level above. Yeah, if he covered you on Nirvana, Unplugged, right? Like Lead Belly or the Meat Puppets or Bowie, right? He loved you at one level, and then if you were in his diary there, and then of course if he wrote about you in the liner notes, right? And then if he had you open for him too, because that was another thing, like Sonic Youth and the Raincoats he did. That was the other thing, so you could kind of see the influences there. So
yeah, and my final note is that the album's title is ODYSHAPE and it's spelled ODY shape. So I really think there is the Odyssey in this, it is a journey going through this album.
Well, and I know that there was that song seems to be about like almost like body dysmorphia sort of, and I wonder if that's a little bit of the theme as well. I look at the cover art, right, which is sort of like a shapeless figure. That seems like it could be female, but also could be male. Would you say like it's sort of like
it
a
is
genderless,
very, like, nondescript? Yep.
Nondescript, genderless. There's a head. It's also like the coloring of it sort of like very much leads you to like absence of color a little bit with a white cloth. So I thought that was very interesting with the color pastiche behind it.
Yep. Yeah.
So. Yeah, so maybe that's a little bit of what's going on there. But yeah, definitely the song ODYSHAPE seems to be about like body dysmorphia. So maybe like a,
literally an odd shape.
Literally an odd shape is what I'm thinking. Yeah, and that's kind of what the sound of the album is like. It's an odd shaped sound, right? So that's kind of how I took it a little bit. So yeah, I would recommend this one. I connected with this album a little more than I did with the debut, if I'm going to be very honest.
Yeah, same. I would agree.
Gotcha.